Well, hi everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Street Talk, which is brought to you by the Urban Violence Research Network. My name is Andrea Versori, and today in this episode, we're going to talk about how Mexican drug cartels communicate. Now, I guess most of you know about the Mexican drug war and the violence that has taken place. This is an issue that has been going on for like a decade and a half, so it's a very long-standing issue. And this violence has often been quite visible. And in itself, as you can imagine, this is a way that drug cartels use to communicate a message. Now, Mexican drug cartels have used a variety, actually, of ways to communicate. Some are lethal, some are non-lethal, and they clearly are transmitting messages that they are deeming important. The fact that they do so is not self-explanatory because they're criminal groups, so they should be interested in keeping their stuff, keeping stuff quiet. Instead, they don't sometimes. So there are questions regarding why do they communicate? What do they say? And who are their messages intended for? Now, to discuss this very complex issue, I have the pleasure today of speaking with Philip Johnson. So Philip is a lecturer in the writing program at Princeton University. He completed his doctorate in political science at the City University of New York in 2022, so very, very recently. Dr. Johnson, I should call you. While writing his dissertation, he spent 2 years as a visiting fellow at the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies at the University of California, San Diego. And he's also a member of the NORIA Mexico and Central America program. And the last thing that I should add regarding his bio is you should go check him on Twitter because he's excellent on Twitter. And also his Twitter handle is like just great. Like his Twitter handle is, Phil, can you say that?
It's illegitimate.
Exactly. It's a stroke of genius. I actually never said this to you, or maybe I did. But you know, like I find it's not the only reason I invited you, but it's I'm just a sucker for puns, I guess, which is why I live in the UK. So thanks, Philip, for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm glad the Twitter handle is pulling people in.
Exactly, and now you're gonna have people pulled to your Twitter profile, hopefully. So you know, it's never enough. So I would like to start this interview basically by just asking to tell us a bit about yourself. What is your academic background? What is your research background? And how did you come to this topic?
Okay, yeah. Well, so to begin with, the accent doesn't always give it away, but I'm originally from Australia. I did my undergraduate degree in the University of Sydney, but I've now been living in the US and in Brooklyn for over a decade. And I sort of got onto the research path I'm on during a few years before I moved to the United States. I lived in Mexico. I was a English teacher, like an English language teacher there. I worked with kids. And this was in the fairly early days of the sort of war on drugs, on narco trafficking. So I arrived there in 2009. The so-called war had been going on for a few years, but it was around this time, 2009, that it was becoming apparent that this war wasn't a quick thing that was going to lead to some rapid political success or social change and then be done. Right, the war was dragging. Violence was increasing. It was spreading from the areas in which it was already concentrated to other parts of the country. So although I wasn't in Mexico to do research, I was sort of consuming, digesting the news and the sort of word of mouth about what was happening in the country. And a lot of what we, I mean very loosely, we were telling ourselves about who was in danger, who was safe, what was going on, the sort of dynamics behind things kept being sort of knocked down, right? We would say, oh, it's okay to do this, but not this, and then something would happen. We'd be like, okay, so actually we're probably wrong about what isn't safe, who aren't safe. So that was the sort of the initial sort of spark. It took a while for me to get back to that. I started doing graduate studies in the US. I eventually started a PhD. It was some maybe 7 or 8 years before I could come back to Mexico and start researching the topic specifically, by which time the war was still going on, but had morphed somewhat. A new president had come in and had changed the way the war was talked about without really de-escalating the war. So that was the sort of way in, was just happening to be in Mexico at this time. And while I've tried to both keep researching Mexico and look abroad, this fundamental thing is something I keep coming back to, not just Mexico and what is happening there, but this particular period, the early years after the war was declared, and when the patterns were emerging, but we didn't really know what to make of them yet.
This is actually pretty interesting, because it's always interesting whenever, of course, there's a lot of people who do, of course, they start their PhD right after their master's, and that, of course, makes a lot of sense. But then it's always interesting when you find people that have done so, because of personal experience that was completely different from academic research, but of course drew them to this topic in this case, and also the disconnect between what we hear about what's happening on the ground, so to speak, and what is actually going on. Can you tell us more? Because I mentioned the issue of like communication by drug cartels, and probably like in a very, very, very simplified way. Of course, it doesn't do justice. So can you do justice? Like, can you tell us more about the PhD topic and what you researched on?
Oh, you did a great job, actually. That's the the elevator pitch right there, I think. So let's see. I call the topic I study criminal communication, but it's really a subset of criminal communication, I think, because I'm particularly interested in, as you suggested, the fact that criminal actors, organized crime outfits would speak or communicate very publicly, right? We have a sense that where there are mafias or criminal outfits operating, they speak subtly and in coded ways all the time. There are criminal argos, there are criminal codes, there are symbolic forms of messaging, there are secret handshakes, all the sort of classic stuff of almost like Hollywood crime, right? So that, and I think there are fairly good explanations for why that would happen. A lot of it to do with keeping things clandestine and keeping things sort of visible to the insiders, but invisible to the outsiders, right? Or incomprehensible to the outsiders, like the government, the state. So, and criminal communication gets puzzling when it's broadcast in a way that the general public or state authorities can understand, right? So when it, for example, turns up on social media, when it is deliberately positioned to make it into the newspapers, or when, in some cases, it's sort of simultaneously presented in public for the sake of journalists and then circulated on WhatsApp or Facebook to make sure that if the journalists don't get message, the general public will get the message. So this, I think, is what's really puzzling here, is when formally private forms of communication go public and very deliberately public. And often, sort of not even just in a sort of limited way, like everyone in the town square knows about this, but where anyone who picks up a national newspaper or anyone who happens to be on the right Facebook page will see this, like locally, nationally, internationally. And then the sort of the second part to this is that, of course, we have some really great theories on why criminal actors sometimes engage in very public acts of violence. But the assumption tends to be that if it's worth going public, violence is the way to do it for a criminal actor, right? Violence is a costly signal. It shows that you're committed. It shows that you're capable. It shows that you, mean what you say and are not to be messed with, basically. So we have great theories of this, but when we look at how criminal outfits or organized crime groups are interacting with the public, they are sometimes engaging in public violence, sometimes engaging in public messaging, sometimes engaging in both, and more often than not, they're staying silent, right? They default back to the sort of the silence and keeping things under the radar fairly quickly. So I think while we have a partial picture with the idea that violence can be public or private, invisible or visible, we need to add the fact that it's not just whether you display the body or kill someone in public, for example, but whether there is messaging, communicating, speech going on at the same time. And I think when we overlap those things, communication and violence, we see that different sort of dynamics are at work in different combinations of these things, right? It's a different thing to just kill versus to kill and to explain why you kill, for example. That's the sort of starting point. I guess I should say that one other thing is that's the broad sort of puzzle of criminal communication. Mexico is a great case, or a fascinating and frustrating case at times, because there's an added question there about the timing of all this stuff, right? The criminal communication or narco-messaging, which we can get into, starts around the time of the war on drugs, but not exactly in line with the war on drugs. It's sort of already there, but escalates sharply and expands dramatically after the beginning of the war on drugs. So I think there's a few sort of overlapping things happening in Mexico around the same time, right? There's liberalizing, democratizing moves happening at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, which quickly merge into the beginning of the war on drugs. So somewhere in this period of time, sort of between about 2000 and 2006, but maybe really 2000 to 2010, is when a lot of this stuff comes to the head. The war on drugs, the results of liberalization, democratization, and these changing patterns of criminal behavior and activity that we haven't seen in Mexico for decades and decades before that.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack here, and as you said correctly, it is a starting point. But just one thing I want to make clear for our audience. So what you're saying is that narco-messaging, cartel messaging was happening before, but it escalated. So basically, it became much more common with the start of the war on drugs.
Yeah, that's right. And it was after the beginning of the war on drugs that the real standard term narco-message emerged. Before that, in newspapers, I've dug around and found articles about this, but it's not just like, here's another narco-message. It's like, well, this weird thing happened at this crime scene in this town. We saw a bunch of messages scribbled on the wall, or cardboard sheets with threats and things written on them, displayed at the scene. And while the violence really grabs the headlines, this other stuff is slowly emerging in the very early 2000s. Right after the beginning of the war, I think you get the real sort of establishment of almost like a typical form for these things. And the newspapers start calling them narco-messages, and you see later when social media really kicks off, you see narco-messages and a whole sort of narco vocabulary turn up. So yeah, I think the war on drugs is not just the beginning of this stuff overall. It's really a change in the way we understand and talk about it, and a real increase in the frequency and visibility of it.
This is pretty interesting. So thanks for clarifying that bit regarding the timing. I would say probably it kind of begs the question of let's first maybe the modes, because of course you mentioned that sometimes it's about violence, so it's about leaving a body in a public place. Sometimes there's violence and a message coming with it. And then there is just the message, if I'm not mistaken. So sometimes criminal groups just leave a message in a very public place so people can see it. So can you get us through maybe like a few, I don't know, maybe just the most common ways in which criminal groups in Mexico are communicating?
Absolutely. I think so, and my research focuses specifically on narco-messages as sort of the type of communication I want to look at, right? But there are a few typical forms of narco-messaging within that. So the first to emerge, the simplest is really just a sheet of cardboard or a big piece of paper with a Sharpie or something, just and a message scrawled, often really crudely. The newspapers often make fun of the spelling and grammar of these messages, but a quickly sort of scribbled message written on a piece of cardboard and dumped at a crime scene, often alongside a body or at the scene of an attempted murder or something like that. So those are the early narco-messages. They tend to be heavy on insults, threats. They often talk a little bit about why things are happening, like we're the new guys in town, we're going to get rid of all the bad guys or the kidnappers or something like that. with time, and by the time I arrived in Mexico in about 2009, messaging was becoming, I suppose, more sophisticated and certainly taking on different forms. So a related term to narco-message is narco-manta, or manta, which is a sort of narco cover or a narco, it really means a narco banner, although that's not a direct translation, but large, often printed vinyl banners, sometimes like bed sheets with paint on them, but big messages, things that are visible from a distance, which can be hung from a bridge over a highway is a very common place to put them to maximize sort of visibility. In a town square, from fences outside of schools, government buildings, places not just where people are, but where a lot of people are at a predictable period of time, right? So if they hang a message outside a school during the night, at the morning sort of drop off, a lot of people see the message, they take photos, they send them around, right? But the message makes a wave. Same with hanging messages from bridges, designed to catch morning traffic, sort of peak hour traffic. So these, when I say more sophisticated, I mean not just that the messages themselves are bigger, larger, often produced in more complicated ways, but the sort of the strategy of making sure these things get attention is also evolving. What I would say is that so I said that messaging can certainly happen without violence, and that's true, but messaging without violence still has to make a bit of a splash. So what you don't see much of is one sort of isolated message with no body, with no shootout, no something like that. It tends to be either one written message at the scene of an act of violence, or many messages without violence, or maybe one really big spectacular message in an unexpected place. But one way or another, there's always something with the message to make sure it grabs attention.
When you say a very spectacular message, because you piqued my curiosity, of course, what do you mean? Like, is it like, do you mean maybe a message spectacular in its content because it's challenging the federal government, or is it a particularly violent threat? What do you mean by that?
A bit of both. There's actually, there is some spectacular language in the messages, although it actually rarely sort of takes on the whole government. It's much more often targeted at rival gang or cartel members, or at specific allegedly corrupt cops or members of this sort of security apparatus. But when I first said that, I meant that some of these messages are 3, 4, 5 meters long, sort of massive things that would take a team of people to sort of unveil them off the side of a bridge, or one of the biggest ones I remember hearing about was about 5 meters long and was left in the central market in the city of Oaxaca. So really designed to be seen by everyone, and for people not just to be like, oh, there's a message, but to be like, yeah, that's a huge message. I think part of what's behind this as well is the signaling, not just that like, hey, we can get in here and leave a message, but that we can like roll up with a pickup truck and a giant banner rolled up in the back, and a bunch of us can walk through here and we can hang this up and we can unroll it and walk away. And who's going to stop us, right? There's a real, I think, sense of signaling behind this of like, we can put this here because either you can't stop us, or because the authorities won't stop us, or because we're unstoppable.
Yeah, it's really, I think, it's a bit disquieting that they would put these messages in front of schools, as you mentioned, although it makes sense from a communication point of view. Clearly there is a message about at least impunity, or at most territorial control, I would suggest, because I mean, this clearly says something about who can get in, and do this sort of stuff, and this clearly shows a in a pretty evident way. You mentioned about the content, its threats, and you mentioned the newspapers making fun of them for their grammar, even though I guess they don't really care. And I guess that says also something about the people themselves. Like, these may be people, and are likely to be people, who left the education system way earlier than they should have, and this is of course part of the problem. What is the content? What extent are these threats? Are these about crime in the community? Are these about the police? So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. And just on that point about sort of the grammar and things, I think reading not just the messages themselves, but the newspaper reporting on the messages, there's actually a level of sort of credibility in a badly written message. Some of the messages that seem a bit too well written generate sort of commentary where commentators and pundits are saying, this seems like a hoax, like this seems like a student or something, right? Like the expectation is there that this should be full of insults and slang and badly written, and anything that seems a bit too polished isn't seen as a better message. It's seen as like, well, this is a message, but is it really a narco message? Are these the real guys, like the real, the criminal guys behind this? But more broadly on the content of messages, there's a lot of variation and some pretty clear patterns, I think. As I already mentioned sort of briefly, members of government or sort of security actors get called out a lot in messages, but the messages tend not to take a direct sort of like combative approach with the government overall. I think there are certainly a lot of threats in messages, but especially when sort of talking to elements of the state, there are a lot more denunciations and sort of attempts to accuse or inform or share intelligence on state officials. So an example of this would be a guy who's now locked up in Brooklyn, Genaro Garcia Luna, who was the Secretary of Public Security under Calderon at the beginning of the war on drugs, before he was arrested for alleged corruption and sort of taking bribes from members of criminal groups. He was often denounced and accused of this behavior, and we wouldn't say that narco messages are accurate and you can therefore take them as like records of fact. But for years of this guy's tenure, from time to time, messages, often like a lot of big messages at the same time displayed across different cities, like in very sort of coordinated displays, would come out and accuse this guy of taking bribes, usually from the same one or two cartels, accuse him of sort of renting out the federal police for either drug trafficking or for protecting drug traffickers. Would sometimes accuse him directly of violence or of being willing to use violence in a way that the state shouldn't. So this was a bit of a surprise. I kind of figured that written messages would mostly be threats and that they would be very directly seeking leverage, right? If you don't do this, we'll do this to you. But I think with these denunciations, we see something a bit less direct and a bit more about sort of general influence, right? Creating suspicion about these guys and allegedly bringing to light things that are hidden, not presuming to threaten this guy directly. For example, like there are no messages that just threaten the Secretary of Public Security and say, hey, if you don't play ball, we'll come after you. It's always this more indirect thing about like, we know the truth about you, we see what's really going on, we know what you're up to, this sort of thing, which has a threatening element to it, but is not even the suggestion that like they have the capacity to take down high-ranking members of government or something. So there's a sort of complex package of sort of actions that can be happening through these messages, right? Threats, sure, but also denunciations. Also, as you've already suggested about territorial control, sort of marking out borders and saying, we now own this town, the old guys are out, we're in. What else? Also a lot of stuff I mentioned very briefly at the beginning, a lot about the motive behind violence, right? Not just threats saying we're coming after you, but saying, hey, we're only after the bad guys. We're only after this cartel, or we're only after the kidnappers, or we're after this guy because he attacks women and children or something like that. So there's a lot of rationalizing and sort of explaining violence, sort of creating an order for the violence, right? Like if you're a good upstanding citizen who doesn't go to the cops, you're fine. If you engage in any of the stuff that they call bad stuff, you're in trouble. So those would probably be the main sort of types. We've got threats, we've got accusations or denunciations, explanations, and that sort of territorial demarcation going on.
Okay, so this is all really incredibly fascinating. At least I find it incredibly fascinating, and there are so many questions I would like to ask in limited time. The first one is, tell me if I'm wrong, it seems that these criminal groups have an idea of how citizens should behave and the state should behave, but it's kind of a flipped idea. And it's just partly flipped. So you just said, like, if you're an upstanding citizen, you don't talk to the police. So clearly there is a like rules of behavior, but normally you would think that reporting stuff to the police is the good thing to do. Of course, from their point of view, you're an upstanding citizen if you don't talk to the police. And also they seem to have a specific, like a not so flipped view of the state. They seem to be accusing these people because they're corrupt, but I mean, they should be happy that they're corrupt. They should be angry that they're not corrupted by the right people, so themselves. And instead they seem to have kind of making point about ethical behavior by state officials, but is it just a threat, or is this aimed at maybe putting suspicion in the community, or is this based on like cultural concepts about how politicians should behave? What do you think about this?
I think this is a great point. There are probably a few things going on here. One, I think you're absolutely right to say that some of this speaks into existing sort of cultural expectations or values. And that I think is not just specific to narco-messaging or criminal communication, right? That's sort of good marketing or good propaganda in general, right? Is to not rock the boat too much, but to speak to what people already have a sense might be true. And these across these messages, right? These are not for the most part sort of revolutionary manifestos. They're not saying we need an entirely new social, political, moral order. They're mostly saying the order we have is okay, but we would like to be in control of it, for example. So I think that comes out in terms of the sort of the social aspect of messaging. There's a lot of very uncontroversial stuff like we're against kidnappers, we're against extortion, we're against people who treat women badly, that sort of thing. Fairly traditional, but very sort of standard values. Something similar is true with the government, with this idea that the government should not be engaged in corruption, should not be uneven in the fight against crime, should not be inefficient in the fight against crime. And in some messages, not a lot, but in some of the more sort of the lengthy messages that really like get going on this, they'll even say we're not trying to be the government, or we do things a different way. Like we know the truth because we have illegal information or clandestine information. So I think this is to me, this is a strong indication that these messages are not trying to replace or overturn the government. They're trying to sort of push back and maybe limit or corner the government a little bit. The denunciations against government agents have to put these guys on the back foot at least a little bit and make them cautious about how they present themselves to the public. But that's not the same as trying to like overthrow the government or even to like influence elections or something necessarily. It's much more of a question of constraint, of sort of carving out a space where these criminal actors can operate. I think in some cases that there's certainly a sort of discourse of the government shouldn't be corrupt and is corrupt. We don't claim to be perfect, but we'll get the job done. Like we're not hypocrites because we don't claim to do things by the book. In fact, if it doesn't work to do things by the book, do things our way, right? So that, which I think we see in certainly recurs in Mexico, but there are echoes of that in other places of Latin America, I think, where different kinds of extra legal group claim to do sort of paramilitary or vigilante sort of to take on these roles that are about providing a level of justice or a level of order because the state seems unable to do things in the limited way that a democratic state should do things.
Sure. This is. Thank you for responding to this question, because there's clearly quite a few things here that are present, and it seems to me, among all the things that could be said, comments like about this, that you just said. They are drawing lines, not only territorial, spatial lines of like saying these space is ours, for example, but they're drawing borders between them and the government. Clearly not aiming at toppling the government or whatever, but basically saying, leave this to us and we will leave the rest to you. So they're doing borders between institutional borders, so to speak, which is quite interesting, because that shows that they may have, it may be just propaganda, of course, but they may have an idea of how their coexistence between government and crime should work. But
yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, no, please.
What was I going to say? I think you also, I think, briefly mentioned something about credibility earlier, and there's a big question mark here about how credible these messages are. But I think, especially some of these more sort of complicated messages with more to them, I think it seems to me that these are not a case of saying like we are great and legitimate and the best option available. It's more like the government is so untrustworthy and so corrupt and so inefficient that you might as well take a chance with us. Right?
It works.
Going through delegitimacy. Yeah.
Sure. No. I mean, they're not a revolutionary movement, so they don't have to aim that high. They just need to show that the government is like worse than them. Thank you for covering the issue of credibility, because I was going to mention that. You mentioned briefly the fact that they're not electoral messages, but then gives me like a small question: are these about elections at all? Are there instances of these messages basically being about local elections, municipal elections, or even state elections, or does this not feature at all?
That's a good question. I think you see more evidence of this at very local levels. So I've talked mostly about the way narco-messages address high-level government actors, but at more local levels, I think there's a more intensive sort of contestation going on. Meaning, there are also denunciations of mayors and governors and that sort of thing, but a broader package of things happening as well. In some cases, direct threats, but mostly against very local officials or candidates, and more often local police units or deployments of federal police units or military units. So that's where you do see some threats against state actors, but it's never, death to the police or death to the army. It's always these guys in this town, we know where you are, or we know your squad cars, or we have you in our sights, or something like this. It tends to be very localized, and you do see, I think, some move to sort of shift public opinion about candidates and mayors and things to that level. My data for now is mostly for the 1 6-year period, the presidency between 2006 and 2012. So there are elections going on in there, but it would take, I think a longer sort of sample would give a better idea of how governorships, especially, for example, are maybe either causing, or either messages appear prior to elections, or elections generate messages afterwards. The other thing which I think is interesting is the sort of the bookends of this time period, 2006 to 2012. There are interesting sort of campaigns of messages in the lame duck periods between when a president is elected and a president is inaugurated. Right, the first really high-profile campaign of narco-messaging occurs in 2006, between when Calderon is elected and when he's inaugurated. Calderon goes on to declare war on drugs, but there's something, I think, interesting going on, not just where narco-messages try and shape elections, but where the outcomes of elections are also periods of uncertainty. And I think there's this period of time that Mexico has quite a long sort of lame duck period, several months between election and inauguration. So there's this period of time where, in theory, policy is up for grabs, and potentially behind the scenes alliances are up for grabs, right? So I think see some interesting things happen in these windows of time where we know who the next president or the next official is going to be, but we don't know how things are going to play out. And we see some interesting narco-messaging happening to sort of, again, constrain or influence or sort of shape what might come afterwards.
Okay, it would be quite interesting to explore that period. I guess you have some ideas already on what to do when like moving on from your PhD. I think it will be interesting maybe to go a little bit more in detail before we move to other stuff on the data that you collected. So I think you mentioned like what are the years that you have been looking at? Have you looked at like a specific region of the country? Have you looked at like specific newspapers? So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So as I said, the data I have is mostly from 2006 to 2012. The total collection of narco-messages I have spans from about 2004 to 2013. That's my approach was always just to grab as much information about as many messages as possible, even if that means I don't have like an accurate sample of a larger pool of messages. Most of my research is qualitative, and most of my dissertation got into case studies. So I wanted as many messages as possible to have as many interesting sort of cases and examples to dig into as possible. In collecting this stuff, I didn't know exactly how it was gonna go. I started doing it in Mexico. I was prepared, if necessary, to dig into sort of physical archives of old newspapers and things. In the end, I could do most of the archival work online. That there was surprisingly good and relatively accessible and searchable newspaper archives that let me sort of dig in and find a lot of information. And all told, I have at the moment a little over 6,000 instances of messages. Very few in the early years, 2004, 2005, even 2006, and then a real takeoff to hundreds of messages in 2007, to thousands of messages at least by 2010, if not earlier. And then it tapers right off again in 2012 and 2013. And that's not because there are less messages in those years, but because the government sort of by that point is very wise to the fact that narco messages make the headlines and make front page news and generate a lot of attention. So by 2012, I think the government working with the media were sort of having more of a conversation about like what should and shouldn't we be reporting or publicizing here? What, and how beneficial is it to quote verbatim from a narco message versus to just talk generally about it, right? What does the public need to know, and what ends up being, as a lot of people said to me and at the time, like what constitutes just being a mouthpiece for the cartels versus informing the public about cartels. So I've got definitely imperfect data for those years. My next step is also to look earlier, which is going to take a much more fine-toothed search to try and find out how common this messaging was in the years before the war on drugs. It looks relatively uncommon, but I want to know exactly how uncommon it is, and I want to know for sure where this first emerges and how it spreads. I've got a sense of that now. I think it seems to begin in 2004 in the northeast of Mexico, but I want to just comb more newspapers and be really sure that I'm not missing a whole phenomenon that's been going on for years before that or something.
It's quite fascinating. Like I hope you really do this this piece of research, because the origins of this phenomenon are probably going to be very interesting. And it's also interesting the thing that you mentioned about, of course, the role of newspapers in talking about these messaging and spreading them. How much of it is informing the public, and how much of it is helping the criminal groups. And like a very similar thing, a very similar issue, of course, is present in Brazil, for example, where in Rio there are several commands, gang alliances, basically, and For 20 years now, it has been policy of most newspapers not to mention their name, which makes for very confusing reporting because like they have to say basically, oh, the biggest gang alliance in the city, by which everyone knows they're talking about the Red Command, the Comando Vermelho. And so there is a debate whether, even mentioning the name is informing the public or, helping these groups to gather reputation. So there was a question I wanted to ask you about attribution, because of course you mentioned that these, when you mentioned about the students writing like messages with like too good of a grammar, how do we know that these messages are made by those people that claim to be the others? How do we know that this is not maybe a rival group trying to basically attract attention on them?
That's a great question. It's a crucial question. The final answer is we don't know, and there's always the possibility that individual messages are hoaxes or are sort of false flags like this, where one group tries to implicate another group or something like this, right? To some extent, and again, I say individual messages, certainly it's hard to verify. Patterns of messaging are easier to verify, I think, in the sense that, similar to what you're saying, at certain times in certain states, there are only certain groups that would have the capacity to leave messages, especially sort of prominent messages outside government buildings or many messages at the same time, right? So some of these messages aren't even signed because the idea is like, hey, if you see 30 messages in the state of Tamaulipas at a certain period of time, it's the Zetas or the Gulf Cartel, the sort of the guys that were heavily in control of that state at that time, right? I think one of the curious things is, given that we would expect there to be hoaxes and sort of fraudulent or sort of fake news narco-messaging, there are very few sort of retractions where there's any public effort for a group to say, whoa, that wasn't us, right? There's a lot of groups saying those guys performed that act of violence. No, we didn't. You did this act of violence. That's sort of like pointing the finger about responsibility for other things. But there's almost no cases I know of where a message appears making some claims and then another message appears saying that wasn't us. We would never say that. Right? So that doesn't. I don't think that means that there's no sort of fraudulent messaging going on. I think what it probably partly means is that a consistent message that's fraudulent is almost as valuable as a sort of authentic message, right? Meaning, if you're a criminal group trying to establish your territorial control over a town, and some like local gang starts using your name to also post messages and threaten people, it doesn't necessarily harm the reputation of the group whose name is being signed, right? So there even might be a little bit of free advertising in that. I've certainly read and heard of cases where criminal actors do seek out people who are sort of trafficking or extorting using the name of a different group. But it seems more like that happens behind the scenes. The messages themselves are allowed to be there and to stay sort of uncontested. But behind the scenes, if the group thinks there's like a local kidnapping ring or someone using their name, they tend to pursue that sort of subtly, not in public. So it is a problem. It's not something that is completely not something I can account for completely. What I would tend to say as a qualification is that I'm ultimately less concerned about who the author is and why they're doing it, and more about what happens when these things go public, right? So 30 messages all attributed to the same group with no one claiming otherwise. It doesn't matter as much to me who the real author is. The group's public presence is 30 uncontested messages, right? So that at least allows for the fact that, 5 of those messages could be hoaxes, but they still are being written and included in the sort of the public discourse about a particular group being in a particular place, being up to certain things. So I think in that way, hoaxes are always potentially present, but maybe don't completely change the narrative or don't completely change the way criminal groups are perceived.
No, this makes a lot of sense, and it seems to be a very good explanation of like how attribution clearly plays an important role, but to some extent, of course, like the message in a lot of cases becomes the most important thing, and the fact that these groups can allow these sorts to happen is in itself like a notable fact. Just I would probably focus my very last question, I swear, on you mentioned that what's interesting a lot of times is what happens when these messages go out into the public. So like maybe not like the authors, sure, but how the public receives them. And you mentioned newspapers and but also WhatsApp groups and social media. So I was interested in, are criminal groups fully exploiting social media or messaging apps? Are they using them just to propagate or to circumvent like newspapers not sharing the messages? So what is the role of basically online communication?
It's a great question, and a really one that I think is sort of continues to change and has changed beyond the period of time I focused on in my project. I think social media and WhatsApp messaging weren't super important to my data collection because newspaper reporting was fairly good, and I could get sort of verbatim message transcriptions from newspapers, right? So at the time, and when I was in Mexico in 2009, 2010, 2011, Facebook was there, but Facebook was not as common and as pervasive as it is now. So it wasn't necessarily the first place to look for the most recent happenings in a town. That has changed now, I think. I think now Facebook, WhatsApp, online sort of blogs and things like that are probably one of the first places you would go to catch new narco message or communication content. That's also partly down not just to the advances in technology and the spread of technology, but also the fact that mainstream media doesn't report as directly on this stuff, right? So to get the full text of a message, you wouldn't go to a newspaper now, but you would go to like a WhatsApp group or Facebook page. And in fact, actually, what you were saying about Brazil sounds very similar to the way reporting changed in Mexico. In about 2012, 2013, it goes from this group, here is the message, here's what's happening, to one of the 2 or 3 biggest groups in this neighborhood who are currently undergoing a turf war, ... So that both the availability of technology and also the lack of other close reporting has amped up the importance of things like WhatsApp. I mean, the other thing to bear in mind, I suppose, is that I use mostly national or sort of state level newspapers, like fairly major newspapers that had online archives. But the first way I heard about narco-messaging was in the daily sort of tabloid newspapers, which in Mexico are called the Nota Roja. They tend to be full color and have really violent images on the front page, and are displayed every morning outside newsstands or by vendors at coffee shops and at intersections and things. So even if you don't read them, you will see the front page, right? So I think the Nota Roja functions a bit like social media later functions, because it's just around, it's everywhere, it circulates throughout the city, and it really grabs the eye. So even outside of what the main newspapers were doing, and even when the main newspapers would start to be a bit more cautious, the Nota Roja remains a place to go for both violent images and sometimes images of narco messages, often partial transcriptions, or in some cases also screenshots of WhatsApp or Facebook messages and things like that. So while technology and social media especially has become increasingly important, there are analog media that do similar things, and that aren't just national magazines or newspapers, but also aren't on your phone.
This is also quite interesting. Like I find particularly fascinating the idea that people will see those images, even if they don't see the actual scene, the actual message, the actual bodies, or the combination of the two. And even if they don't buy the newspapers, just because those newspapers are there on the newsstands, they will see, and people clearly will talk about that. So there's an element of like word of mouth, and of course those newspapers found like a market in that. So really talks to us like researchers trying to find even the more local version of the data that we're finding, and try to really combing in some ways, trying to find different kinds of sources so that we can find as much data as possible. And it seems like you have quite a lot of things to to look forward to regarding taking your research on. I will stop here, because I mean we will probably be able to go on for several hours, but that would be a video that no one would watch it, or maybe I don't know, our parents or something. But basically, Philip, thank you for taking time for this interview. This is really fascinating. This is really urgent as well, because I guess that this is still ongoing. So this is something that really we should take as researchers, we should take basically a really good understanding of it. And I'm sure that our viewers have loved to hear you talking about it. And I'm sure we will all keep an eye out for future publications. So I want to thank you. I want to thank everyone who's been watching these up to now, up to the very end. Thanks for tuning in to this new episode. If you like this episode, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Yes, we're asking you if you could do that. Check our other episodes if you like this. And you can find the Urban Violence Research Network on Twitter, on Facebook, on LinkedIn. You know where to find Philip, because that was one of the first things that I said. So thanks again, Philip, for coming here. And I will see everyone soon for the next episode.
Thank you, Andrew. Really appreciate it.